Welcome to episode negative 10 of Successful Demo. In each episode, we analyze the theoretical and practical aspects of one or more existing cards. Today, we'll be flipping over to the Corp side. It's been a while since we done HB, but there is a card that I really want to showcase, and that's none other than Eli 1.0. What I feel is the best ice ever printed in the entire run of Android Netrunner. I'm not even kidding. Even when you pit it against the likes of Tollbooth, Fairchild 3, and all those good stuff ice, I still think Eli was the most busted piece of ice ever printed. Let's see why that's the case. Eli 1.0 has absolutely phenomenal numbers. It is only 3 to res, and for that amount that you pay, you are inducing a high amount of tax on the runner. Most runner icebreakers require at least 3 credits to get past Eli, and well, it's an ice. Eli sticks on the board, so every time the runner wants to penetrate through your Eli server, they've got to pay the tax, and that adds up very quickly. For for a very minimal effort, right? Just installing Eli 1.0 for a click and paying 3 credits to res it, you are securing a server very well for the rest of the game. Eli 1.0 also hits a lot of sweet spots in terms of numbers. The fact that it's like exactly 4 strength means that it is immune to David, since it's not at 5 strength yet, and given that it's 1 influence, it is easily splashable, so you see it being run in a lot of decks outside of faction, not just in HB. Now, of course, when the designers printed Eli 1.0 with such pushed numbers, you imagine that they thought that the Bioroid downside was the mitigating factor. The fact that you can click through it, meaning that Eli 1.0 is more porous than at first glance. And that's true. However, you're not really coming out ahead as the runner if you're spending clicks to break Eli 1.0. In fact, spending half your turn to get past an ice that only costs 3 for the corp to res feels really bad. Compare that to, say, spending the same 2 clicks on, Nareen 2.0, for example, or something like even Heimdall 1, for example, Heimdall 2. Sure, you're taking 1 brain damage, but, at least your click to break goes further because those ice are way bulkier and take much more money to break with icebreakers. With Eli 1.0, it feels really bad to spend a click, just to break this lowly piece of ice. So this is why Eli is so good. It's very cheap, and it just, works so well at all stages of the game. Even late game, Eli 1.0 is an ice that you wouldn't mind slapping on your weaker server. Adding 3 or 4 credits extra to get through that server is never a bad thing. And a lot of players realize this. If you see throughout the history of the game, there are just not that many breakers that deal with Eli 1.0 very well. In fact, you might think of Paperclip as the gold standard for Fractors, but even that requires 3 credits to fully break an Eli. What actually works the best is actually the AI breaker in Armor and the Shaper Fractor in Cerberus Lady. However, both of those have their respective downsides. With Armor you need to charge your turtle up to 4 strength. That is quite a high demand. Right? The corp can easily purge you, and then you lose your cheap means of breaking through Eli. As for Lady, it is without question the best breaker you can use to break an Eli 1.0 because it only costs 1 credit every time you get through it. The problem is it is limited in use. You can only use it 4 times on Eli's before it runs out of tokens, but presumably you have scavengers and clone chips to deal with that. Except that Scavenge has been removed from System Core. Sorry. I think that's the case. You can correct me in the comment section if I'm wrong. So yeah, good luck with that. Also, Cerberus Lady is in Lunar Cycle, and that's rotating as well. So yeah, Eli 1.0 stock is going to only go up from here if you ask me. Now, your B tier breakers are still okay. You're never really happy breaking Eli for 3 credits, but Paperclip does the job, as does Battering Ram, surprisingly. Despite it being a virtually unplayed breaker, it deals with Eli fairly efficiently. The first Eli only costs you 3 credits to break, and subsequent Eli's 2 credits because it retains strength for the remainder of the run. So that's really neat. If you are expecting a lot of Eli's, well, Battering Ram's your solution. Corroder, your go-to Fractor, breaks Eli for 4 credits. That feels really bad. So I think if you're looking for efficient breaking, you have to either deal with the downsides of Armor Core and Lady, or maybe play some support cards like Net Ready Eyes or Data Sucker. Now back to the history of Netrunner. We've seen Eli played in so many competitive decks. I won't say it was played in every single deck, but it was easily one of the, if not the most splashed card, at least on the co-op side, in the entire game. In 2015, for example, you have the two most predominant decks. Astrobiotics, this fabled deck that basically warped the entire meta, running 3 copies of Eli 1.0 because it only cost 1 influence. And then the deck that won that year's Worlds was RP, Replicating Perfection, that also ran 3 copies of Eli 1.0, synergizing very well with the fact that it's a Bioroid, meaning that, RP, an identity that already click compresses the runner by forcing the runner to lose a click to challenge the central server before running the remote. Then if you put an Eli 1.0 on the remote, they have even fewer clicks to challenge that remote. So yeah, Eli 1.0 just works so well in so many decks. Even as time went by and rotation loomed, Eli 1.0 was still being played in many decks. When Polana became a thing and RP was seeing less play, Eli 1.0 was still the go-to splash ice in Polana, even though you don't have RP's click taxing ability. And then in Faction, you still see Eli being played even up till the point where rotation happened. Moon Knights, the dominating deck of 2017, ran 3 copies of Eli for the most part as well. So Eli, very ubiquitous for very good reason. Right, all that said, one reason why Eli 1.0 has seen less play in recent days, or recent years rather, before rotation, was that IP Block came onto the scene in Flashpoint Cycle. And IP Block is very similar to Eli 1.0 in many respects, just colored a different color. IP Block has some advantages over Eli 1.0, including the fact that it's cheaper to res, punishes AI breakers, and actually has a face check punishment, which is very relevant against the turning wheel. So you can farm turning wheel counters by headbutting into Eli 1.0 repeatedly, but you can't do the same with IP Block. That being said, Eli 1.0 still has some advantages against IP Block, which is why I still consider it to be the best ice ever printed. Firstly, Eli 1.0 actually costs more to break if you consider that the runner isn't tagged, because with IP Block, all you need to break is the first subroutine. The second subroutine does absolutely nothing if the runner isn't tagged. So with Corroder, for example, IP Block costs 3 to break, whereas with Eli, you always have to pay 4 credits. Eli 1.0 also has the click compressing ability that we discussed earlier, and more importantly, is also not countered by tag avoidance, which admittedly is seeing some play nowadays with CTM being powerful and everything. If you can avoid tags during runs using cards like Jasminda and Dome Computer, IP Block suddenly becomes a lot less palatable, whereas Eli 1.0 is immune to such tag cards. Gotta break it the good old-fashioned way. So yeah, Eli 1.0 is still relevant, and being brought back by System Core, I predict it'll still see a lot of play. Now, today we'll be showcasing Eli 1.0, keeping in mind all the benefits of Eli 1.0 that we mentioned previously. Right, you might remember the mid-range metal deck that we showcased a while back. This was before System Core. I've basically adapted it into today's deck, so let's discuss some of the card choices. First off, the agenda suite has been preserved. It's a very solid agenda suite, as I discussed in the mid-range metal successful demo video. Having no 3-point agendas, forcing the runner to win on 4 agendas is a nice thing. It's also much easier to score 4 advanced agendas than, say, global food initiatives. We are running Eli 1.0s because last time Eli 1.0s weren't, Eli rotated out in between first rotation and System Core. So back then we used IP Blocks to substitute for the Elis, but now that we've regained our Elis, we can now play some border controls. Border control works very well with Eli 1.0 for the same reason that Replicating Perfection does. If the runner is running on your Elis without an icebreaker and wants to click through them, well, they won't be able to get to the base of your server if you have a border control there, and they won't be able to rerun the server because they won't have the clicks remaining to click through Eli a second time. So I like that synergy there, and this is why I'm playing border control. Also helps shore up the number of barriers we have in the deck. You'll notice that we are playing more ice than previously, and bulkier ice at that. That's because Compared to last time, run-based archetypes are emerging with the presence of crowdfunding. Yeah, run-based criminal decks are starting to become a thing. So I did want some more taxing ice in the deck. And having more ice means that I can lock them out of servers as well. This is why I'm also not running Jeeves Model Baroids. You just cannot play naked Jeeves anymore against run-based decks. It's too easy for them to get security testings and crowdfunding triggers. We are still playing Surveyor here because we need a critical mass of good sentries, and yeah, let's face it, Ichi 1.0 just doesn't cut it. We need to dig into the Wayland faction. In fact, we need to dig into the MWL as well to find Surveyor, which synergizes super well with Ginger Grid. That combo stays, it's still powerful as ever. That's mostly it. So I'll just hand you over to the gameplay video where you watch the Eli 1.0's swarm my opponent. We wake up to find an absolutely nutty opening hand versus Ken Tenma. This hand is beautiful because it has 3 copies of Eli 1.0. How glorious is this? And the best part is, we mandatory draw into Gatekeeper. It's very hard for me to explain why this is amazing, but just pretend you're Ken Tenma here. You have 3 copies of Dirty Laundry in your hand, and then the corp decides to ice all the servers turn 1. Now you're a very sad puppy. So this is why I absolutely love this opening. I drew into so many ice and they were all affordable. They were not high range ice like Surveyor or Fairchild 3. So I could potentially threaten an ice res on every single server to thwart my opponent's Dirty Laundry, or at the very least, slow them down, impede them, make them pay 2 clicks to get their Dirty Laundry money, which is pretty good in my opinion. My opponent counters this by playing Expose. They expose the Eli 1.0 on my remote and then make a run on that server, and I allow them in because I knew that at 4 credits they couldn't trash my Ginger City grid. So that was a wasted run on my opponent's end, and they played a crowdfunding to end their turn. I'm able to res my Ginger grid here to start stacking ice on my remote. The first thing I see is a Project Vitruvius. That's not an ice, but the other reason why my opening hand was amazing was because I had a big money card in NGO front. So after setting up my central servers, I could easily install Double Advance, and this gives me the money to res all my central ice to once again thwart my opponent's runs. This is absolutely amazing. So my opponent sets up a bankroll. We know that they are a run-based deck because they're running Ken Tenma. You know that they have lots of run events in their deck. There's no better way to make the runner miserable than to, make them, keep all their run events in their hand unplayable, absolutely unplayable, because they just can't get through my servers. I draw a border control here, and that's an amazing ice to see. You always want it on your remote so that they have to be dragged through your remote twice just to challenge your agendas. You'll notice that I pre-res the NGO front there. That's because there was really no advantage in bluffing the NGO front when it is protected by an Eli 1.0 that my opponent could easily bounce off. On the other hand, if my opponent is running Interdiction on the off chance, and I left my NGO front unres, I could have been completely screwed right there. So NGO front, very important. Now that I draw into an agenda that I actually want to score in remote enforcement, I'm going to pop the NGO front and threaten the score. I did not do this with the Vitruvius earlier because Vitruvius isn't really an agenda you want to score as your first agenda. It does nothing for you. Even though the Smart Metal identity fires, you're not getting much mileage for scoring 2 points there. So I'd rather score a remote enforcement that reinforces my remote, obviously. And that makes, that feels way better than just scoring a Vitruvius. Now, my opponent finally gathers the courage to play a Dirty Laundry, but they chose the wrong server. The one server where Dirty Laundry would fail was HQ. Double fail, in fact, because the Gatekeeper ends the run very easily, and then the Chrysium grid on HQ would also fizzle the Dirty Laundry should they have had a way to get through it. So my opponent picked the absolute wrong server here and got punished for it, because now I get to fire Gatekeeper's subroutine. I'm going to be able to shuffle the Vitruvius back in my deck because that's not really an agenda I want to score just yet. And then ending the run, killing the Dirty Laundry run. That feels really, really good. Now, usually you score the remote enforcement here, but with double hedge fund in my hand, I felt like to play it. And more importantly, because I res the Gatekeeper last turn, my HQ suddenly becomes very porous. Gatekeeper was at 6 strength last turn, but if I don't ice up HQ here, Gatekeeper goes back down to 0 strength, and the HQ ice becomes a known quantity, making it easy for my opponent to attack HQ. So you see here as they drop their Armor Core, which is able to penetrate through the Gatekeeper. If I had scored the remote enforcement on my last turn instead of reinforcing HQ, my opponent would be running rampantly on HQ this turn, trashing the Christian Grid on HQ, maybe even firing a diversion of funds, an emergency shutdown, all sorts of nasty stuff on HQ, trashing my Rashida. Those are things that you don't want to happen. So I made the absolutely right choice there by fortifying HQ with an unknown ice, making it very hard for them to run HQ. They were forced to poke R&D instead, and it was just a waste of time for them because Eli 1.0, nasty. It's not something they can challenge at this point efficiently. I continue slow rolling my remote enforcement here because I drew into IPO right there. I wanted to play IPO while I still had the money to play IPO, instead of losing money to score remote enforcement. Now my opponent here reveals that they were on interdiction all this while, so once again validating that pre-resing NGO was the correct move quite a few turns ago. Now my opponent actually challenges my remote and is able to break all my ice. Border Control and Eli fall to my opponent. Eli's porousness coming into play here as a downside, but Border Control shoring up that weakness by forcing my opponent to end the run. This is why I talk about when I say click compression. If my opponent doesn't have the correct breaker for Eli, which they don't, they aren't able to run the server twice because they need 3 clicks to run the server. 1 to make the run and 2 to break Eli, and they just can't do that twice. Border Control forces them to run through twice, which they weren't able to, and this makes it very easy for me to score my remote enforcement here, get a Surveyor out, and I'm going to draw 2 cards because I have enough money to support my ice reses, and both cards were ice, so I'm able to stack more ice with my Ginger Grid, putting my res Surveyor now at 8 strength. When it came in, it was only at 4 strength, but because of the double card draw from Sports Metal's ability, it combos with Ginger City Grid, and now my Surveyors are a whopping 8 strength. I don't even really need to res the other 2 ice on my remote. The 8 strength Surveyor here just stops my opponent flat out, because their main breaker's Armor Core, they'll take forever to get 8 strength on their Armor Core, and there's no way they're going to trace through the Armor Core. So yeah, they're basically in a lot of trouble here. That being said, I'm not being too cocky with my agenda scores here. I need to keep in mind that they can inside job my remote at any point, and this is why I always need at least 3 credits before I jam anything in the remote. I need to be able to res the Gatekeeper on server 1, which is the second outermost ice. The outermost ice is another copy of Surveyor, which will also punish my opponent. Now my opponent tries to find an opening, any sort of opening at all, into my central so that they can get their crowdfundings back, but to no avail. Eli is revealed on archives as well, so there is no cheap way through my servers at all, and with Armor Core at only 2 strength, they can't bust through my Elis without clicking through them. Feels bad. Now I don't continue stacking ice on my Ginger remote because I knew that as long as I could afford to rest any of my ice on the remote, my opponent wasn't getting into the Ginger remote. I'd rather have the ice on centrals, because I'm concerned that my opponent can, once they have 4 Armor Core counters, they can start doing some nasty stuff on my centrals. So I manually install some stuff on R&D. I think that's a Gatekeeper on R&D plus a Ginger City Grid on R&D as well. So subsequent ice that I'm drawing will go straight on top of R&D so that I don't have to pay the clicks or credits to install them. This should fortify me against Apocalypse as well. I don't think I mentioned this, but I'm playing 2 copies of Christian Grid in this deck because I'm very afraid of Apocalypse. It's a very hard counter to a Ginger deck. Ginger decks usually stack lots of ice on the remote, leaving the centrals very vulnerable, and Apocalypse abuses that. So to get around that, I need to have lots of defensive upgrades on centrals. Christian Grid to stop the Apocalypse, and Ginger Grid to stack ice on centrals as well. Here I score another agenda that gives me forward tempo and hyperloop extension, claiming all the credits. So spend 3 credits to score the agenda, but 5 credits return from Sports Metal and hyperloop itself. My subsequent plan will be to score the remote enforcement in my hand as long as my opponent doesn't get to it, but they might because their Armor Core is at 3. I wasn't paying attention The fact that they have Armor Core at 3 and the fact that they know that the HQ Ice was Architect means that they can now run through my server for 4 credits every time. This is not good. So they get through my server, and here I pre-res the Christian Grid. Reason being, I don't want them to play Emergency Shutdown on my remote Surveyor. And I also want them to I'm also worried about an apocalypse here. That is a very scary prospect. So I need to make sure that the HQ run is not counted as successful. So yeah. They follow it up with a diversion of funds, which is very expected from Ken Tenma, but I was more than prepared for it. Because I'm only on 3 credits, the diversion of funds is going to be of minimal impact, and I'm even going to res my Ginger on R&D, putting me down to 2 credits, so they're getting very little mileage. 4 credits to break through HQ, they're only getting a 4 credit gain from diversion. Sure, they're sapping me of 2 credits, but I don't really need money at this point. I would have tried to score an agenda, but they stole it from my hand anyway. That being said, this is a very good turn for my opponent. They are able to almost equalize the scoreline and find a way through my central servers. So the logical move here is to purge virus counters so that they don't get free reign on R&D and archives as well. So post-purge, I am in the driver's seat once again. Even though I'm on 0 credits, my opponent is on 0 as well. So being dirt poor, they have to spend the next few turns clicking for credits, and then the subsequent few turns clicking for Armor Core counters. They have to click through the Archives Eli for each and every one of my Armor Core counters, and that's slow and tedious. This will buy me enough time to score the sales team from my hand as I slowly click for credits myself. Right, so yeah, my opponent's just stuck in a hole right here. No show gamble, they're just clicking for credits every turn. So giving me a very safe opportunity to score the sales team here. As I mentioned, I respect Inside Job as a possible card my opponent could use to steal my sales team, but as long as I maintain 3 credits in my pool, I'm able to res the Gatekeeper on the remote, which would thwart an Inside Job. They might get past the Gatekeeper with Inside Job, but they can't get past the Surveyor after that. So I had my bases covered there, and my opponent knew that they couldn't get through my remote either, so instead they set up drawing a bunch of cards, and what will they play here? We await in heated anticipation. Right, so they're gonna play Special Order here, finding the solution to Eli 1.0. Finally, they found a way to get past this nasty piece of ice. It's their Corroder. They're not playing it just yet. It's still in their hand. Not enough clicks to do so. So, just gonna score my sales team here while I can. Sales team is gonna give me the drip econ I so badly need, because right now I'm dirt poor and the IPO in my hand is unplayable. So we get the sales team going. This puts us at match point. So from now on, all I need to do really is to just keep jamming stuff in the remote. They have to check it every time because it could be the game-winning project Vitruvius. I could even score a 4 advanced agenda from an unadvanced state because I have Baltic Labor as well, but being poor, that is not really on the table as an option yet. Passing over to my opponent, let's see what they do here. Click 1 is draw. Click 2, they play Deuce's Wild, alright? So they are going to gain 3 money here, and they're going to use the Expose ability to start charging up their Armor Core. They expose one of my ice, doesn't really matter, they know all my ice anyway because I revealed them with Ginger. And then they ran R&D, knowing that I can't rest the Fetch Out 3 here. They run R&D, click through the Eli, and access the top card of R&D. Make that 2 because they have accumulated some turning wheel counters as well. Now, that's one downside of Eli 1.0. My opponent theoretically could have just kept headbutting into Eli to charge up their turning wheel in the past few turns at the expense of setting up. So that's always dangerous, but thankfully my opponent did not see any agendas there, so now I'm able to safely install Advance and install Christian Grid on HQ, taking sales team money at the start of my turn so that I can still threaten the Gatekeeper on the remote. The reason why I put Christian Grid on HQ here is very simple. If they had a way to get one more Armor Core counter, they can easily ruin my day by diversion of funds on HQ, followed by emergency shutdown on my remote Surveyor. So really just covering all my bases here. If they attempt to divert my funds here, I res Christian Grid on HQ, I am immune. If they attempt to inside job my remote here, I res Gatekeeper on the remote, I am immune. My agenda is safe. And if they try to attack Archives or R&D here, I'm completely fine with that. They are not going to win the game off R&D with only 3 counters on the turning wheel. So yeah, just really playing to not lose rather than playing to win. If I were to play to win there, I would just take credit, install, advance the sales team. But here playing the Christian Grid on HQ just really seals the game for my opponent, as they will not be able to make use of their powerful run events to turn the tides their way. They finally get the Corroder down and prepare to assault my R&D. So they run R&D here. I'm not going to bother resing the ice because, as I mentioned, I know that for a fact they can't win off R&D. They need 3 agendas to win, but they can only access a maximum of 2 cards on this R&D run. So they get through. I could theoretically stop them here. I could res the Gatekeeper on R&D, but I'd rather save the money to res the Christian Grid on HQ or the Gatekeeper on my remote in case of an emergency. They are not going to expand the turning wheel counters here though, because they are going to chalk up those turning wheel counters for use on HQ. They were planning on a HQ run all this while. That R&D run gave them the virus counter needed to break through HQ, and they're going to see 3 cards here. I'm going to let them do just that. Not even going to bother resing the Christian because I knew there were no agendas in my hand. So with 1 click remaining, I knew that they had no way to contest my remote. And with only 1 credit, they certainly couldn't get through. So I'm just going to score the game-winning sales team right here. Eli 1.0 doing work. So much work. I'll let you watch our post-game chat as I do a retrospective on the game. It really was decided on turn 1 when I opened with Eli Gatekeeper on all 3 centrals. That just completely fizzled any opportunity for my opponent to get any form of run-based economy going. That was really huge, and this is, I think, how you play against run-based criminal. You just lock up all the servers as soon as humanly possible, and you're done, right? Having a 3rd copy of Eli for my remote ice so that I could start playing Ginger Grid and Geofront was a nice bonus as well. You could see that even though at the end of the game my opponent managed to finally find their Corroder, even then, that Corroder wouldn't have done much because without the economy to support it, they're just not getting through Eli at a reasonable rate. Paying 4 credits for each run through Eli is really bad when my opponent doesn't have any economy resource taking at all. So this is the sheer power of Eli, the ability to just single-handedly stop a run-based deck. And, that's really powerful. Because in most other matchups, I would actually focus more on the remote and play rather loosely on centrals. I wouldn't ice archives, maybe leave R&D at most single ice with Eli 1.0, not even a copy of Ginger Grid on it, while dedicating my effort to rushing. Every turn should be spent installing or advancing agendas. But in this matchup, taking it slow, dragging out the game was clearly the right choice because my opponent just couldn't make any headway. Their bankroll never got to roll. You also notice that every time my opponent forced me to res one of my central ice, the Gatekeeper on HQ and then the Eli 1.0 on R&D, I made sure to counter that by putting a fresh piece of unres ice on top of the res ice. That way my opponent has to keep guessing. They can't run safely because they don't know what unres ice I have on those servers. Deterring run-based decks from playing aggressively and preventing them from using their run-based events and economy is how you defeat said archetypes. And I think this game showcased that. All that being said, I would caution that this game isn't exactly representative of this sports metal deck's power level, simply because I got a favorable matchup and a very favorable draw here. I slotted in Christian Grid into this deck to deal with Apocalypse decks. It just so happened that run-based criminal decks got caught in the crossfire. I think run-based criminal decks without Apocalypse, if you're using like Maker's Eye, Legwork, that sort of stuff, are pretty fair decks. Unfortunately, they just get hosed by Christian Grid so badly. You saw that turn when my opponent ran HQ with a Christian Grid, was forced to trash it, and went down to 0 credits at the end of the turn. Yeah, that's the power of Christian Grid, and was just really unfortunate for my opponent that I managed to find both copies of my Christian Grid during this game. As always, let's round off with combos and non-bos. Eli combos very well with Ravana 1.0. I mean, all Bioroids do, but Eli doubly so, because it has the very precious and the run-sub routine, which surprisingly few good Bioroid eyes have, if you think about it. Like Fairchild 2, Itchy 1, yeah, all those don't really have end the run subroutines. So having more ice in your deck with end the run subroutines besides Fairchild 3 is quite valuable if you're playing an all Bioroid deck. So having lots of cheap ice is also a good thing, given how Bioroids can be rather expensive. So very good combo. Would recommend playing them. Next up, if you're looking to splash G's Model Bioroids out of faction for no influence, Eli 1.0 gets you there. You want to run 6 HB cards, ideally all 1 influence, and Eli 1.0 is makes it to the list along with other good 1 influence HB cards like Maryland Campaign and Team Sponsorship. So you choose from this list depending on what sort of deck you're running, but Eli 1.0 always a good option. Next up, stacking Eli 1.0 with itself. Turns out Eli is a good combo with itself. As you saw this game, we managed to spread Eli's across our entire board, and that made it very difficult for our opponent to deal with because they didn't have a good fractal solution. Another way in which you can abuse Eli 1.0 is to place them 2 copies of them on the same server. This way, you force the fractal solution because they cannot click through both Elis. That would require 4 clicks, which they won't have because they'll need 5 clicks on their turn in addition to the 1 click needed to make the run on said server. So double Eli 1.0, very powerful. Just beware of certain icebreakers like Battering Ram that thrive against double Eli. Now let's move on to Nombo. Surprisingly, I would say Architects of Tomorrow is actually kind of anti-synergistic with Eli 1.0. If you're using Eli 1.0 to trigger Architects of Tomorrow, you have to note that because Architects of Tomorrow only fires when the runner passes a Bioroid Ice. If the runner chooses to bounce off the Eli instead by letting it end the run, your ID ability will not actually trigger, unlike with other more porous HB Bioroid Ice. So yeah, Eli 1.0's end the run might actually work against your favor if you're playing Architects of Tomorrow. Now if you do it the other way around and use Architects of Tomorrow to res an Eli 1.0 instead, you're also coming out behind because you're supposed to get a 4 credit discount, but Eli only costs 3, so you're wasting in effect your 1 credit's worth of discount there. That being said, if you for whatever reason need to run an Architects of Tomorrow deck, I think it's still correct to run all 3 copies of Eli 1.0. Not because they synergize well with each other, I've just explained why they don't, but simply because Eli 1.0 by itself as a standalone ice is so good that you just run it, right? Eli 1.0 has enough merits on its own to warrant running, even though it doesn't synergize that well with Architects of Tomorrow. It's so good. And as I mentioned earlier, it combos with Ravana 1.0, which you are probably running Architects anyway. So yeah, makes a lot of sense, and it just goes to show how powerful Eli 1.0 as a card by itself is. Another nombo is Ice Boosters. You might be tempted to say, Eli is a pretty strong ice, what if we made it stronger? Use cards like Sub Boost and Patch, condition counters that boost the power of Eli. Well, unfortunately this is also a nombo. If you attempt to increase Eli 1.0's strength to prohibitively high levels, the runner will simply click through Eli instead. This is one of the reasons why Stronger Together as an identity is not that good. Because boosting ice strength does not make it more taxing to break subroutines using clicks. Now, if you try to increase the number of subroutines instead, well, that will cost more clicks to break. Using sub boost on Eli 1.0, you need 3 clicks instead of 2. Seems good, right? However, against runners with paperclip, they still break an Eli 1.0 with extra subroutine for the same amount of money. 3 credits to break 3 subroutines. So sub boost not going to be useful in every single matchup. I think all this goes to show that Eli 1.0 just does so much work on its own that this is how it should be played. It's like hedge fund. You don't go out of your way to make hedge fund better than it already is. It just is. It's just good. You accept it for what it is, and you either play it or you don't. And if you play it, you probably want all 3 copies of it. It's a really solid piece of ice like hedge fund. It's a workhorse in your deck. You don't need to build a deck around it. That's what Eli is. So yeah, that's all for this video. And what can I say? This sports metal deck is a blast to play. And you know what else is a blast as well? Well, it's the coming new year. Hope everyone has a blast this coming 2019, and may everyone have a wonderful blast of a year. That's all. I'll see you in the next video. Till then, thanks for watching, and happy holidays to all.